Deleuze will develop this theory of intensive individuation, heavily indebted to the work of Gilbert Simondon, along three series: that of space, that of time, and that of the psyche. But difference will only attain its maximal intensification in psychic individuation. Thus, it is the latter which provides the key to the transvaluation of the transcendental proposed by Deleuze in Difference and Repetition. If this transvaluation allows him to circumvent the Kantian question of representational access, as well as the Heideggerian question of existential access, without relapsing into a metaphysical dogmatism shored up by an appeal to intellectual intuition, it is only insofar as psychic individuation, whose paradigm is provided by the third synthesis of time, marks the point of intersection at which the dialectic of ideas and the aesthetic of intensities, or ideality and sensibility, ultimately converge in a double genesis of thought and being. So let's briefly recapitulate Deleuze's account of the three series of individuation: spatial, temporal, and psychic. Spatial individuation is not characterized by a movement from abstract universal to particular through the gradual specification of genera and the continuous division of parts, but rather via discontinuous ruptures and abrupt transitions in a metastable system. This pre-individual field must comprise at least two heterogeneous orders of intensive differences. And Deleuze defines intensities as differences of differences, or unequalizable quantities. When the disparity in potential between series crosses a critical threshold of disequilibrium, it causes a sudden exchange of information between series. It effects a coupling between terms of the series and allows them to enter into relations of mutually reinforcing internal resonance. So this synthesis of space involves an asymmetrical dynamism whereby an undifferentiated, and Deleuze writes undifferentiated with a C here, but fully differentiated T. There's a actual differentiation, or the differentiation of actual species and parts, occurs on the basis of a virtual space or an intensive spacing, which is completely differentiated, or it incarnates these ideal multiplicities, these differential structures, which remain purely virtual. But it's on the basis of its own, the catalysis of individuation, that space or extensity becomes apprehended in terms of volumes, sections, individual qualities, etc. So temporal individuation is similarly complex. Its elements are the three syntheses of time. The first is the contraction of the present in the passive synthesis of habit. Habit is the contraction of a difference between two bare repetitions contemplated by a passive self. And bare or spatial repetition is only possible, or thinkable, Deleuze seems to mean here, on the basis of a synthesis which contracts difference from mere repetition parties, extra parties, i.e. the kind of repetition as difference without a concept. Thus it is represented or contracted by a passive self, which is itself neither representative nor represented. And this contraction of difference from repetition constitutes the sub-representational depth without which bare repetition would be impossible. So in Deleuze's account of the genesis of time, habit engenders the living present as the time and space of conservation necessary for representation. But the paradox of this present, says Deleuze, is that it constitutes the present in a time which is itself unconstituted. Thus, another time is necessary, wherein the first can pass. For if the past had to wait for a new present in order to become past, then it would prove just as impossible for the old past to recede as for the new one to arrive. Thus, the present would never pass if it were not already past at the same time as it is present. So there is a paradoxical contemporaneity between the past and the present which it was. Moreover, if each past is contemporary with the present which it was, then all of the past must coexist with the new present relative to which it is now past. Where habit is the foundation of the experience of time, memory, or the subsistence of the pure past within every present, provides the ground for that foundation. So following Bergson, Deleuze calls the synthesis of memory the transcendental synthesis of time as a whole, whereas the present and the future are merely intra-temporal dimensions. But the notion of time as a whole remains problematic from the viewpoint of a philosophy that claims to have overturned representation. Time cannot be subsumed under the identity of the one. So though the second synthesis is ground of representation that remains irreducible to the present, it continues to be relative to what it grounds. The difference between past and present remains subordinated to the identity of a pure past and to a relation of resemblance between that past and the present which it grounds. Thus, according to Deleuze, the second synthesis has merely introduced movement into consciousness rather than time into thought. It has not yet prized the difference which grounds representation free from the strictures of representation. And it is this splitting of passing time into an empirical present and a pure past that needs to be accounted for. The second synthesis explains how the passing of time presupposes an a priori split between the passing present and the past that was never present, or between the empirical present and the a priori past. But what is required is something that will ensure the synthesis of these two, that will ensure the synthesis of foundation and ground, or past and present. And this is the function of the third synthesis for Deleuze. Okay, Deleuze ties it to the Kantian paradox of inner sense. Kant discovers time as the transcendental difference between thinking and being. It is the condition of possibility for their correlation. The relation between the determination of thought, exemplified in the I think, and the indeterminacy of existence, exemplified in the I am, the two terms of the Cartesian cogito, is only possible if we assume a third thing, time as the form under which the indeterminate is determinable. But the form of the determinable is that of the passive self. For Kant, time as the form of inner sense introduces a split between the active or transcendental I and the passive or merely empirical self. But for Deleuze, affectivity as such is already grounded in the passive synthesis of contemplation, contraction, and the active syntheses of representation, which already presuppose the passive sub-representational syntheses of contraction and memory. Consequently, as far as Deleuze is concerned, there can be no active self-identical I corresponding to the passive self. As Deleuze puts it, this is a quote, "The death of God does not leave the identity of the I intact, but installs and interiorizes within it an essential dissimilarity, a demarcation in the place of the mark or seal of God." End quote. This demarcation is effected by what Deleuze will call the pure and empty form of time, which splits the I and correlates it with a merely passive self, or a purely passive self.